The late summer sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Virginia City as Matthew Harris's painted wagon rolled into town, its weathered canvas sides emblazoned with promises of miracle cures and mystical revelations. The former Union cavalry officer had transformed himself into a traveling showman after the war, finding that people's desperation for hope and entertainment could be just as profitable as any gold strike. Behind him rode his partner Rebecca Lewis, a sharp-minded woman whose talent for reading subtle details about strangers had helped craft their successful mind-reading act. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her calculating eyes took in every detail of the prosperous-looking town as they passed the newly constructed bank building. The plains stretched endlessly around Virginia City, broken only by the occasional ranch house and the vast herds of cattle that had brought unexpected wealth to this corner of the territory. But beneath the prosperity, Rebecca sensed something darker. The townsfolk who stopped to stare at their wagon wore expressions that seemed more guarded than curious. At the livery stable, they met David Wright, a weathered rancher who eyed their wagon with open skepticism. "Another medicine show," he muttered, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Guess the gold rush brought more than just miners. Now we got every kind of hustler passing through." But there was something in his tone that suggested he welcomed any distraction from the town's usual routines. The local banker, John King, emerged from his brick building to study the newcomers. His expensive suit and gold watch chain marked him as a man of means, but Rebecca noticed how his hand trembled slightly as he dabbed at his forehead with a silk handkerchief. She filed away the detail for later use in their act. Grace Young, the owner of the town's only hotel, offered them rooms at a reduced rate in exchange for free tickets to their first show. "We don't get much entertainment out here," she explained, her eyes darting nervously to the bank building across the street. "Might do everyone good to think about something else for a change." That evening, as Matthew set up their show tent on an empty lot beside the hotel, Andrew Harris rode in from his sprawling ranch to the north. The cattle baron's arrival caused a stir among the townspeople, but Rebecca observed that he barely acknowledged their greetings, his attention fixed instead on the bank where John King still worked late into the evening. Victoria Wright, David's wife, stopped by the wagon to purchase a bottle of Matthew's miracle elixir, but seemed more interested in warning them about the town's peculiarities. "Folks here don't take kindly to having their secrets exposed," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Some things are better left buried with the bones out on the prairie." As darkness fell, Rebecca watched lamplight glowing in the bank's windows, where John King's silhouette moved restlessly back and forth. She had performed their mind-reading act in dozens of towns, revealing harmless secrets that entertained audiences while carefully avoiding any truly dangerous revelations. But something about King's nervous manner and the townsfolk's strained politeness suggested that Virginia City's secrets might prove impossible to keep buried. The sound of hammering echoed through the growing darkness as Matthew finished preparing the show tent. Rebecca studied the town's residents hurrying past, their faces illuminated briefly by lamplight before vanishing into shadow. Tomorrow night they would begin their performance, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their usual act might unleash forces beyond their control in this seemingly prosperous but oddly tense community. Hannah Lewis, the young schoolteacher who had recently arrived from back east, stopped to watch their preparations with obvious fascination. "I've never seen a real mind-reading show," she admitted, twisting her hands in her skirts. "Do you truly see into people's thoughts?" Rebecca gave her practiced, mysterious smile, but noticed how the girl's gaze kept drifting toward the bank, where John King's shadow still paced. As they prepared for bed that night in their rooms above Grace Young's hotel, Matthew sorted through the day's earnings from elixir sales, while Rebecca recorded her observations in her leather-bound notebook. The walls seemed thin enough to hear every creak and whisper in the building. Through her window, she could see the lights still burning in the bank, and wondered what kept John King working so late, his shadow moving with the nervous energy of a man haunted by his past. The next morning dawned with an unsettling stillness over the plains, the tall grass barely stirring as Rebecca made her way down the hotel's creaking stairs. Grace Young was already busy in the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee and biscuits mingling with whispered conversations that fell silent as Rebecca entered. She couldn't shake the feeling that the entire town held its breath, waiting for something to break the surface of its carefully maintained facade. Matthew had risen earlier to set up their tent near the livery stable, where the morning sun would draw curious onlookers to their first performance. As Rebecca crossed the dusty street, she noticed David Miller, the town's deputy, watching her intently from his post outside the jail. His hand rested casually on his gun belt, but there was nothing casual about the way his eyes followed her movement. The morning crowd gathered slowly, ranchers and townspeople alike drawn by Matthew's practiced patter about their miraculous elixir and Rebecca's supernatural abilities. She spotted Hannah Lewis again, this time accompanied by Victoria Thompson, the banker's wife, whose rigid posture and tight-lipped smile suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. But it was John King himself who commanded Rebecca's attention when he emerged from the bank, his presence sending a ripple through the assembled spectators. During their performance, Rebecca employed her usual techniques: careful observation, strategic questions, and the occasional lucky guess. But when John King reluctantly volunteered, something changed. As she held his pocket watch, supposedly to channel his thoughts, genuine images flooded her mind. Smoke-filled trenches, a different name on military papers, screaming civilians in a language she didn't recognize. The watch slipped from her trembling fingers, and King caught it with unexpected agility, his knuckles white against the gold case. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Rebecca knew he recognized her genuine shock. This wasn't part of the act. The air between them crackled with unspoken understanding, and King's carefully constructed mask slipped for just a second, revealing something dark and desperate underneath. He recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that didn't reach his eyes, but Rebecca had seen enough. That afternoon, Matthew noticed increased foot traffic at their medicine wagon, but not for their usual remedies. People came with whispered questions about King, about what Rebecca had seen. Grace Young lingered longer than necessary while purchasing her bottle of elixir, dropping hints about the banker's arrival 3 years ago and how the town's fortunes had mysteriously improved since then. As sunset painted the prairie sky in shades of amber and rose, Rebecca observed more unusual activity. Deputy Miller spent an hour in deep conversation with Michael Hayes, the telegraph operator, while Victoria Thompson made a rare visit to Abigail Carter's dress shop on the edge of town, emerging with no packages but tear-stained cheeks. In their room that evening, Matthew counted their highest daily earnings yet, but Rebecca barely heard him. She was too focused on the new entries in her notebook, the way King's accent slipped when startled, the military bearing he couldn't quite disguise, the German phrase she'd glimpsed in her vision. Below these observations, she added another note. Andrew Fletcher? Cross-reference with Santa Fe newspapers circa 1865? Through the window, she watched John King's shadow once again moving in the bank. But this time, she noticed something else. Deputy Miller's silhouette joining his, their gestures suggesting an argument. Rebecca realized their simple medicine show had inadvertently pulled at a thread that could unravel not just John King's carefully constructed identity, but perhaps the very fabric of the town itself. A soft knock at their door made both Rebecca and Matthew freeze. Hannah Lewis's whispered voice came through the wood. "Miss Rebecca, there's something you need to know about Mr. King, about what happened in Virginia City before he came here. Please, people's lives depend on it." Rebecca's hands trembled as she opened the door, pulling Hannah Lewis inside quickly before anyone could spot their late-night visitor. The woman's gray shawl was wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes darting nervously to the window where the bank's light still glowed. Matthew extinguished their oil lamp, leaving only moonlight to illuminate their cramped wagon quarters. "I worked at the Miners Exchange Bank in Virginia City," Hannah whispered, settling onto a wooden stool. "Back then he went by Andrew Fletcher, just like you suspected. But that wasn't his real name either." Her fingers twisted the frayed edges of her shawl as she spoke, her voice barely audible above the distant coyote calls echoing across the plains. Rebecca exchanged glances with Matthew, who had positioned himself near the door, his hand resting casually near the revolver at his hip. The medicine show's mentalist act had always walked a dangerous line between entertainment and exposure, but never had it threatened to reveal something of this magnitude. "There was gold missing from the bank vaults," Hannah continued, "nearly $50,000 worth. Everyone assumed it was stolen by Confederate raiders, but I saw Fletcher, King, whatever his name is, loading strong boxes into a wagon late one night. When he spotted me, he claimed it was a routine transfer to Santa Fe. The next morning, 3 bank guards were found dead. The wind picked up outside, rattling the wagon's canvas sides. The medicine show wagon creaked to a halt on the outskirts of Virginia City, its faded purple paint catching the late afternoon sun. Hannah Lewis adjusted her crystal-gazing turban in the small mirror, while her husband Matthew carefully arranged their collection of colored bottles and mysterious powders. After 5 years on the road together, they had perfected their act of mystical insights and miracle cures, though neither possessed any true supernatural abilities, until today. The crowd gathering for their evening performance seemed different from the usual mix of curious townsfolk and desperate invalids. Among them stood Michael Harris, the town's prominent banker, watching with an intensity that made Hannah uncomfortable. His expensive suit and perfectly trimmed mustache marked him as a man of means, but something in his eyes spoke of barely contained violence. Victoria Wright, the local schoolteacher, had been hesitant to attend what she considered a vulgar spectacle. But her friend Grace Young had insisted, saying they all needed a distraction from the strange tensions that had gripped Virginia City since the discovery of gold in the nearby hills. The town had changed rapidly, with new faces arriving daily and old neighbors growing suspicious of each other. Matthew began his usual patter about the magical properties of their Egyptian elixir, but Hannah found herself genuinely dizzy as she gazed into her crystal ball. The familiar cloudy glass seemed to swim with actual visions. She saw Michael Harris in a different uniform, ordering executions in a war she didn't recognize. The images came unbidden, accompanied by a certainty that felt nothing like her usual theatrical predictions. When Hannah described what she saw, the color drained from Harris's face. The crowd fell silent, recognizing details of atrocities that had been reported in newspapers years ago. The banker's carefully constructed identity began to crumble as witnesses remembered wanted posters they'd seen, connecting his face to a different name and a series of war crimes that had shocked the nation. David King, the ranch foreman who had been standing quietly at the back of the crowd, drew his pistol with practiced ease. "I knew I recognized you from somewhere, Harris. You're the butcher of Santa Fe." But before he could fire, Rebecca Young, Grace's sister and the town's telegraph operator, stepped between them with her own weapon raised. "Lower your gun, King. There's more to this story than you know." The situation spiraled into chaos as other residents revealed their own hidden connections to Harris's past. John Wright, Victoria's husband and the town's judge, admitted to helping Harris establish his new identity in exchange for financing the town's expansion. Andrew Lewis, Hannah's brother-in-law and local deputy, had suspected the truth but kept quiet to protect the town's growing prosperity. As the sun set behind the plains, casting long shadows across the gathering, Hannah realized their simple medicine show had unleashed forces beyond anyone's control. The crystal ball continued to pulse with visions, not just of Harris's crimes, but of a complex web of deception that had turned Virginia City into a refuge for those fleeing their past. The gold in the hills had drawn them all together, but greed alone hadn't built this place. Abigail Harris, the banker's wife, emerged from their mansion with a leather-bound ledger. "If my husband falls, we all fall," she announced to the crowd. "Every deed, every loan, every secret agreement that built this town, it's all recorded here. We're all complicit in creating this sanctuary, and none of us can claim innocence." The truth of her words settled over the gathering like the evening dust. The medicine wagon became an impromptu courthouse as townspeople argued over what justice meant in a place built on deliberate forgetting. Hannah found herself unable to stop the visions now, each face in the crowd revealing its own story of reinvention and escape. The gold that had drawn them to Virginia City seemed to have a power beyond mere wealth. It had created a community of the haunted, each person carrying their own weight of history. From the back of the crowd, Matthew Harrison, the livery stable owner, stepped forward with weathered hands raised. "There's more to this than just the banker's past," he said, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "That gold we found last spring, it wasn't just luck. Some of us knew it was there because we'd seen the old Spanish maps in Santa Fe, maps that belonged to families who died defending their claims." The revelation sent a ripple through the gathering as connections began forming in people's minds. Hannah felt the pressure building behind her eyes as more visions flooded in unbidden. The stable owner's words had opened a floodgate of memories, not just his own, but those of everyone who'd participated in the calculated deception. She saw glimpses of midnight meetings in Laredo, of documents changing hands, of graves being dug in the dark of night. Victoria Chen, who ran the boarding house on the edge of town, clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "We came here because the plains offered space to breathe," she said, "but we brought our ghosts with us." The wind picked up, sending tumbleweeds skittering past the medicine wagon, as if nature itself was trying to sweep away the accumulated secrets. Rebecca, Hannah's fellow performer, began sorting through their show props with trembling hands. The crystal ball they used for their act had become more than just a prop. It was now a symbol of unwanted truth. "We didn't mean to bring this down on everyone," she whispered to Hannah. "We were just trying to survive, same as them." The cattle drives that passed through Virginia City had always brought news and commerce, but they'd also provided cover for those seeking new identities. Andrew Miller, the telegraph operator, had been the gatekeeper of information, carefully filtering messages to protect the town's residents. Now he stood in the shadow of his office, watching as the carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Grace, the schoolteacher, emerged from her small house carrying a stack of letters. "These came from Amarillo last month," she announced. "Warnings about people asking questions, about investigators following the trail of missing gold shipments and disappeared witnesses. We thought we had more time." Her words carried the weight of impending doom. The plains stretched endlessly around them, the tall grass whispering secrets to the wind. Cattle grazed in the distance, oblivious to the human drama unfolding in town. The medicine wagon's bright paint seemed garish now against the gathering storm clouds. Its promises of miracle cures a pale echo of the real miracle this town had tried to create. The miracle of reinvention. David Cooper, the blacksmith whose forge had melted down more than just horseshoes, stepped into the street. "We can't undo what's been done," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But maybe we can find a way forward that doesn't destroy everything we've built here." The gold in the hills had drawn them together, but it was the shared weight of secrets that had truly bound them. The wind carried the smell of rain and change as Hannah struggled to control the visions that now came unbidden. Each face in the crowd held a story of desperation and hope, of crimes committed and lives rebuilt. The medicine show's bright banners snapped in the rising wind, a counterpoint to the darkening sky and darkening mood of the gathered townspeople. Abigail's ledger had become both weapon and shield, its pages containing enough evidence to destroy lives across 3 territories. But as the town's residents began sharing their stories, it became clear that the book was incomplete. There were deeper secrets, older bargains, and darker deeds that had never been recorded. Truths that were now rising to the surface like bodies in a flood. The gathering storm matched Hannah's internal turmoil as she watched Matthew pace the length of his medicine wagon, his showman's confidence stripped away by the weight of what they'd uncovered. Through her unwanted gift, she could see the threads of deceit that connected the town's leading citizens, golden strands of shared culpability that glowed like fever dreams in her mind's eye. "The banker wasn't just any soldier," she said quietly, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the wagon's wooden wall. "He was at Santa Fe during the massacre, the one they blamed on the raiders." Matthew stopped pacing, his face ashen as he understood the implications. The Santa Fe incident had left hundreds dead, most of them civilians, and the true perpetrators had never been found. Victoria emerged from the shadow of the livery stable, her pristine dress and perfect posture a stark contrast to the mud and tension surrounding them. "My father's ledger tells only half the story," she said, clutching Abigail's book to her chest. "The gold claims were just the beginning. They needed somewhere to hide their wealth, somewhere respectable." Her voice carried the bitter edge of one whose entire life had been built on carefully maintained lies. The distant sound of hoofbeats drew their attention to the road from Virginia City. A cloud of dust marked the approach of riders, perhaps more people connected to the web of secrets they'd begun to unravel. Hannah felt the familiar pressure building behind her eyes as her gift reached out unbidden toward the newcomers. David, the town's deputy, appeared at Matthew's side like a shadow. "There's talk of forming a committee," he said softly, his hand resting casually near his holster. "Some folks think it might be best if certain stories stayed buried." The threat in his words was clear, but there was something else in his voice. Fear, perhaps, or regret. The plains stretched endlessly around them, the tall grass rippling like water in the strengthening wind. A lone cow bawled somewhere in the distance, its cry echoing the tension that hung over the town. The ranches that surrounded them had been built with blood money, Hannah now knew. Every head of cattle purchased with gold stained by the crimes of Santa Fe. Grace appeared in the doorway of her boarding house, her face lined with worry. The autumn wind howled across the plains outside Virginia City as Hannah Wright clutched the velvet curtain of the medicine show wagon, her heart pounding. Through the small window, she could see the mob gathering, their torches casting ominous shadows against the darkening sky. Behind her, Andrew Lewis, the show's mentalist, sat with his head in his hands, devastated by the chaos his performance had unleashed. What had started as a simple mind-reading trick had exposed David Harris, the town's respected banker, as a former Confederate officer responsible for the deaths of hundreds at a Union prison camp. The crowd's angry murmurs grew louder as John King, the town's cattle baron, pushed his way to the front. His face was twisted with rage, but Hannah could see something else in his eyes. Fear. The same fear she'd noticed when Andrew had accidentally revealed Harris's secret. It made her wonder what other darkness lurked beneath the prosperous facade of Virginia City, a town built on the twin fortunes of cattle and newly discovered gold. Matthew Young, the medicine show's owner, loaded his rifle with trembling hands. "We should have moved on yesterday," he muttered, glancing at Rebecca Harris, the banker's daughter who had sought refuge with them after her father fled into the night. The girl sat quietly in the corner, her world shattered by the revelation that everything she'd known about her family was a lie. The gold locket around her neck, a gift from her father, seemed to mock her with its empty promises. The situation had spiraled beyond anyone's control when Michael Wright, Hannah's brother and the show's snake oil salesman, recognized the distinctive tattoo on Harris's wrist during the mind-reading act. As a former Union soldier, Michael had seen that same mark on the brutal camp commandant who had tortured him. The peaceful evening performance had erupted into chaos, with Harris drawing his gun and fleeing into the gathering dusk. Grace King, John's wife, appeared at the wagon's door, her face pale in the lantern light. "You have to leave now," she whispered urgently. "John's gathered the ranchers. They're saying you're all Union spies sent to destroy what we've built here." Her hands twisted in her skirts as she glanced over her shoulder. "But there's more. So much more you've stirred up. Things that should have stayed buried with the gold." Victoria Lewis, Andrew's wife and the show's fortune teller, suddenly grabbed Hannah's arm. Her eyes were wide with genuine fear, not the theatrical kind she used in performances. "The cards were right," she breathed. "Death follows the gold. It always has since the first strike." Harris wasn't just hiding from his war crimes. He was hiding from what happened here 5 years ago, when the gold was discovered. The mob's shouts grew more threatening as Abigail Young, Matthew's sister and the show's herbalist, finished packing her precious medicines. "We can't leave Rebecca," she insisted, motherly instinct overriding her fear. "They'll kill her to keep her quiet, just like they did to the others who knew too much." The words hung heavy in the wagon's cramped interior, laden with unspoken implications. Through the window, Hannah watched as John King mounted a crate to address the crowd. His words carried clearly through the thin walls. "These travelers have brought nothing but lies and discord to our peaceful town. They're trying to steal our gold with their Union tricks." But Hannah noticed how his voice quavered on the word gold, and how several of the older ranchers exchanged knowing glances. Michael suddenly grabbed his sister's shoulder, his face tight with urgency. "It's not just about Harris," he whispered. "I recognized King too. He was there at the prison camp, a guard who helped Harris torture us. And that gold they're so protective of? It's blood money, stolen from Union shipments. Virginia City isn't just built on gold. It's built on war crimes and murder." Rebecca's quiet voice cut through the tension like a knife. "The mine collapse 3 years ago wasn't an accident, was it?" she asked Grace, who had sunk onto a trunk, her face ashen. "All those miners who died? They knew something. Something about my father and Mr. King." Grace's silence was answer enough, and Hannah felt the last pieces of the puzzle clicking into horrible place. As the mob began to move toward the wagon, Andrew suddenly straightened, his face set with determination. "We can't run," he declared. "This isn't just about us anymore. Those miners' families deserve justice. The truth about the gold, the war crimes, all of it. It needs to come out." He reached for his performing coat, the one lined with hidden pockets. "And I think I know how to make them listen." Hannah watched in growing horror as Andrew pulled out a familiar golden locket, identical to Rebecca's. "I lifted this from Harris's office during the confusion," he explained. "Inside isn't a picture. It's a key to the real mine records, the ones that prove everything." His words galvanized the group into action. each person reaching for weapons or supplies, knowing the next few minutes would determine not just their fate, but the fate of justice itself. The wagon's door burst open, flooding the interior with torchlight. John King stood there, his gun raised, but Hannah could see the fear in his eyes. He wasn't facing simple traveling performers anymore. He was facing the truth itself, embodied in the determined faces of those who had nothing left to lose. And as Matthew raised his rifle and Victoria began to chant, Hannah realized that this was no longer a simple medicine show performance. It was the final act in a drama of guilt, greed, and redemption that had been building since the first glitter of gold was discovered in Virginia City's cursed hills. The night air crackled with tension as Hannah stepped forward, positioning herself between Matthew's rifle and John King. The banker's torch cast wild shadows across the medicine wagon's painted sides, making the carnival figures dance like demons in the flickering light. "You can't shoot your way out of the truth, Mr. King," she said, her voice steady despite the thunder of her heartbeat. "Those mine records don't just tell a story about gold. They tell a story about blood." Victoria's chanting grew louder, her words weaving through the cool evening air in a haunting blend of Spanish and English prayers. The sound seemed to unnerve King, whose gun hand trembled slightly. Behind him, more torches appeared as townspeople emerged from the darkness, drawn by the commotion at the edge of Virginia City's makeshift fairgrounds. Matthew kept his rifle trained on King, but spoke to the gathering crowd. "Your respected banker isn't who he claims to be. Before he came here, he was Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison of the Confederate Army, the man responsible for the Amarillo massacre." The revelation rippled through the onlookers, whispers growing into murmurs of shock and disbelief. King's face went pale, the torch in his left hand dipping dangerously close to the dry grass. Rebecca emerged from behind the wagon, clutching the leather portfolio they'd discovered. "The mine records were never about tracking gold claims," she announced. "They were about tracking witnesses, people who might recognize the faces of those who came here to hide their pasts. Every claim dispute, every accident in the mines, it was all about keeping secrets buried." The crowd's mood shifted palpably as Grace pushed through to the front, her eyes blazing with recognition. "I knew I'd seen you before," she said to King. "My husband was one of the civilians you ordered shot that day. I survived because I was in the root cellar, but I never forgot your face." Her words carried the weight of years of silent suffering, and several townspeople moved to stand beside her in solidarity. King's composure finally broke. "You don't understand," he shouted, his refined banker's accent slipping into something rawer, more desperate. "This town was built on second chances. Everyone here came to start over, not just me." His wild eyes swept the crowd, and Hannah saw recognition flash across several faces, followed by fear. He was right. Virginia City's respected citizens included more than one person running from their past. David stepped forward, his doctor's bag still slung over his shoulder. "Starting over is one thing," he said quietly, "but using blood money to build an empire, threatening and killing to keep your secrets, that's something else entirely." He pulled a stack of papers from his bag. "These are death certificates. Too many accidents. Too many convenient disappearances. The pattern is clear once you know what to look for." The tension reached its breaking point as Andrew, the young deputy who'd been helping them piece together the truth, approached on horseback. "Marshall's on his way from Laredo," he announced, "and he's bringing federal agents with him. They've been building a case for months." King's face contorted with rage and desperation. He swung his gun toward Andrew, but Matthew was faster. The rifle crack split the night. King's torch fell, but Victoria was already there, stamping out the flames before they could spread. The banker clutched his shoulder, his gun lying useless in the dirt. As Andrew moved to restrain him, more townspeople stepped forward, some to help, others to confess their own hidden histories. Hannah watched as the medicine wagon's painted promises of miracle cures and mystical insights faded into the background of a greater truth. Their simple act of reading minds had unraveled decades of carefully woven lies, exposing the rotted foundation beneath Virginia City's golden facade. In the distance, dawn was breaking over the plains, the light catching the last remnants of morning mist rising from the grasslands where cattle grazed, oblivious to the human drama unfolding. Michael emerged from the wagon with the strongbox they'd found hidden beneath the floorboards of King's office. "There's enough evidence here to bring justice to more than just Virginia City," he said. "Names, dates, correspondence. a web of corruption that stretches all the way to Santa Fe. The box represented both an end and a beginning, the end of Virginia City's reign of secrets and the beginning of a painful but necessary reckoning. The revelation of banker John Wright's dark past sent shockwaves through Virginia City that reverberated far beyond the initial scandal. As autumn winds swept across the plains, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant cattle, the town found itself caught in an unstoppable cascade of truth-telling that would forever alter its carefully constructed facade. The traveling medicine show's fortune teller, Grace King, had unwittingly pulled at a thread that would unravel decades of carefully woven deception. Matthew Harris, the medicine show's owner, watched from his wagon as townsfolk gathered in heated clusters outside the Cattleman's Bank. The truth about Wright's involvement in the Civil War massacre at Bowers Creek had spread like wildfire, but it was only the beginning. Other secrets began emerging, each more devastating than the last. The town's founding families had built their wealth not on honest cattle ranching as claimed, but on stolen Confederate gold they'd discovered while fleeing justice for their own wartime atrocities. Victoria Young, the schoolteacher who'd been helping Grace develop her genuine psychic abilities, discovered papers in the school's foundation proving that Virginia City itself had been built on blood money. The original settlers, including Wright's father and the Lewis family, had used their stolen wealth to drive honest ranchers from their land, creating the vast cattle empire that now surrounded the town. The revelation shattered Victoria's own family history. Her grandfather had been one of those displaced ranchers. Rebecca Lewis found herself caught between loyalty to her family's legacy and the undeniable weight of truth. As the town's newspaper editor, she had access to archived documents that could either bury or expose generations of carefully hidden crimes. The pressure mounted as both sides sought to influence her decision. Matthew Harris offered his protection, recognizing in Rebecca's tortured expression the same moral struggle he'd faced in his own past. David King, the young ranch hand who'd been working at the Harris Medicine Show, proved to be the key to understanding the deeper conspiracy. His father had been one of Wright's soldiers at Bowers Creek, and before dying had entrusted David with a journal detailing not just the massacre, but the subsequent plot to steal the Confederate gold. The conspirators had killed their own wounded comrades to keep the secret, then used the blood money to build their new lives in Virginia City. As tensions mounted, Michael Young, Victoria's brother and the town's deputy sheriff, found himself torn between upholding the law and protecting the town's powerful families who had given him his position. The evidence of past crimes was overwhelming, but prosecuting them would destroy the lives of people he'd known since childhood. The weight of this moral dilemma drove him to seek counsel from Grace, whose newfound abilities had grown stronger with each passing day. Hannah Wright, the banker's wife, emerged as an unexpected voice of reason. She had married John Wright knowing nothing of his past, but now chose to stand for justice rather than protect her husband's reputation. Her courage inspired others to come forward with their own pieces of the dark puzzle, including Abigail Harris, Matthew's sister, who had been investigating similar patterns of corruption in other frontier towns. The medicine show's presence had catalyzed a reckoning that could no longer be contained. Andrew Lewis, Rebecca's uncle and the town's largest cattleman, attempted to silence the truth by organizing a group of loyal ranch hands to drive the travelers out. But the show's performers, led by Matthew and Grace, had found unlikely allies among the townspeople who were tired of living under the shadow of lies. The confrontation came to a head during a thunderstorm that swept across the plains with biblical fury. Wright and his conspirators barricaded themselves in the bank, holding hostage documents that would prove their crimes. Outside, the town divided itself between those demanding justice and those desperate to preserve their way of life. The storm's lightning illuminated faces twisted with anger, fear, and determination. In the end, it wasn't violence that resolved the crisis, but the power of truth itself. Grace's abilities, combined with Victoria's research and David's father's journal, created an irrefutable narrative that could no longer be denied. The founding family's careful facade crumbled as more townspeople chose truth over prosperity built on deceit. John Wright and his closest conspirators fled in the night, leaving behind evidence that would help restore land to its rightful owners. The medicine show stayed through the winter, helping Virginia City rebuild itself on honest foundations. Matthew and Rebecca worked together to document the true history in the newspaper, while Grace and Victoria established a school that would teach future generations about the importance of truth and justice. The town's cattle empire was redistributed among smaller ranchers, including families who had been driven out decades before. Spring brought new growth to the plains, both in the fresh grass that fed the cattle and in the town's renewed spirit. The Harris Medicine Show departed with the warming winds, but their legacy remained. Virginia City had faced its demons and emerged stronger, its people bound together not by shared secrets, but by their commitment to building a better future. The old power structure was gone, replaced by a community determined to live honestly under the vast prairie sky. As their wagon train disappeared over the horizon, Matthew Harris held Grace's hand, knowing they had witnessed something rare and precious, the transformation of a town's soul. The truth had cost Virginia City its innocence, but had given it something far more valuable, the chance to begin again, this time built on justice rather than deception. The plains stretched endlessly before them, promising new adventures and more hidden truths waiting to be revealed. The Harris Medicine Show's journey continued eastward across the endless plains, but the events of Virginia City had changed them all profoundly. Grace found herself unable to perform her mind-reading act with the same theatrical flair. The weight of genuine secrets had made the playful deceptions of entertainment feel hollow. Matthew noticed her struggling and began adapting their show, shifting toward healing remedies and honest counsel rather than spectacle and illusion. As summer approached, they received word from Hannah, now serving as Virginia City's new bank manager. The town had established a restitution fund for the families who had been wronged during the founding years. More surprisingly, some of the original settlers had returned, including Rebecca's elderly father, who had been among those driven out by the corrupt founders decades ago. The show's route took them through Amarillo, where they encountered Victoria, a former Virginia City resident who had fled during the upheaval. She was building a new life there, but carried news that the ripples of truth had spread far beyond Virginia City's borders. Other towns were beginning to examine their own histories, questioning the convenient stories that had papered over violent beginnings. In Santa Fe, they discovered that John, the exposed banker, had been captured trying to cross into Mexico. His trial would bring more secrets to light, but also offered hope for closure to those he had wronged. The Harris Show performed there for 3 nights, and Matthew noticed how the audiences seemed more interested in genuine connection than mere entertainment, as if the hunger for truth had become contagious. David, the young ranch hand who had helped expose the corruption, had taken over management of the largest spread outside Virginia City. His letters to Grace spoke of how the redistributed land had brought new families to the area, their cattle grazing alongside those of the established ranches. The open plains that had once hidden so many secrets now fostered cooperation instead of competition. The medicine show's reputation shifted as they traveled. Where once they had been seen as charming tricksters, they were now sought out as catalysts for change. Communities invited them not just for entertainment, but for their ability to spark necessary conversations about justice and redemption. Matthew found himself playing the role of informal mediator in towns where old wounds festered beneath polite surfaces. Abigail, who had documented Virginia City's transformation in her newspaper, began syndicating her stories to other frontier publications. Her accounts of how one town's courage to face its past had led to healing resonated across the territories. The Harris Show carried copies of her articles, distributing them along with their usual remedies and tonics. Grace's gift for reading people had evolved into something more profound than her former stage act. She could still sense the weight of unspoken truths, but now used this awareness to help communities address their hidden conflicts before they could fester into violence. The show became known as a place where people could speak openly about the burdens they carried. By the time they reached Laredo, the Harris Medicine Show had transformed into something unique on the frontier. Part healing practice, part traveling fellowship. Their wagon bore the same bright paint and familiar promises of cure-alls, but the real medicine they offered was the courage to face difficult truths and the wisdom to use those truths for healing rather than harm. The plains stretched before them, vast and unchanging, but Matthew and Grace knew that transformation was possible even in the most entrenched places. Their simple show had become part of a larger movement toward honesty and reconciliation in the West. As autumn approached and they turned their wagon train toward new horizons, they carried with them the lesson of Virginia City, that the most powerful medicine was truth, administered with compassion and courage. Behind them, the sun set over the endless grasslands, painting the sky in colors of hope. The Harris Medicine Show rolled on, no longer selling illusions but offering something far more valuable: the chance for communities to write new stories, this time founded on truth rather than convenient lies. The frontier was changing, and they were proud to be part of that change, one town at a time.